Grade 12 Economics. Good afternoon. My name is Mr. Mhlongo and I'm back here with you today on our lesson for inflation. Remember, this lesson is brought to you by Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Cybono Discovery. Today we are starting economic issues. We call this one contemporary economic issues, and this is the only topic that we'll cover in details. The rest will come in revision as we'll be preparing for our paper 2. So our topic of the day is contemporary economic issues. In there we are dealing with the inflation. Remember, this topic is topic for paper 2. Then which are other topics that are the part of this economic issues topic? We have inflation as topic number 12. And then we have also tourism as topic number 13. The last one is environmental sustainability. I will give you a hint at the end of this lesson about the last two topics, but the main focus of the day is our inflation today. So please join me and see what I have in the pocket for you. Firstly, you need to know important dates for this term. Remember, we're in term 3 and we are preparing for preparatory examination for 2025. It is important for you to know the following. On the 11th of September 2025, you will be writing economics paper 1. Your economics paper 1 will be macroeconomics and economic pursuits out of 150 marks. You have section A, section B, and section C. In your section A, you combine 15 marks for macroeconomics and 15 marks for economic pursuits. That gives you 30 marks. In your section B, we have question 2, question 3, and question 4. Your question 2 will be your macroeconomics. Your question 3 will be your economic pursuits. Your question 4 will be the combination or the mixture of both macroeconomics and economic pursuits, both of them contributing 20 marks, 20 marks. And then you have your section C. In your section C, you will be having your question 5, which is your macroeconomics. It says that you must consider in there are as follows: markets of the circular flow in an open economy, economic paradigm or smoothing the business cycle, features underpinning forecasting, public sector objectives or macroeconomic objectives, reasons for public sector failure, linking them to the poor public sector provisioning, as well as reasons for international trade, where we combine both demand reasons and supply reasons, but it depends on the exam. That will be your question 5. Your question 6 will be the following essays. That's economic pursuits. The first essay will be, the first one will be, I'm trying to remember now, export promotion in detail, where we talk about reasons, advantages, and disadvantages. The second one will be on the same topic, arguments in favor of protectionism. And then the third one will be demand side approaches to economic growth and development. The fourth one will be South African endeavors to regional development. The fourth one will be discussing in detail South African growth and development policies. And the fifth one will be discussing in detail economic indicators. And the sixth one will be discussing in detail social indicators. So you have a choice as a candidate. You have a choice on whether you go with macroeconomic essay or you go with economic pursuits essay. As you prepare, please take a side. When it goes to section C, you cannot get to know them all. So it will be fair of you to save time by choosing. If you want to go for macro, we have been doing macro from term 1, term 2, and term 3 now. We are being assessed. So you need to master those 6 essays. Then your story will be very simple. And then going to the 25th of September 2025, that's when you will be writing your paper 2. In your paper 2, you will be dealing with the following. Firstly, you have 3 sections as usual: section A, B, and C. Section A 30 marks. Section B 80 marks, section C 40 marks. Your section A will be microeconomics for 15 marks and contemporary economic issues for 15 marks. That gives you 30 marks. Your section B, question 2 will be microeconomics. Question 3 will be contemporary economic issues. Question 4 will be the combination of both microeconomics and contemporary economic issues. Question 5 will be your essay under microeconomics. Which are those essays? We look at the following. The first essay will be discussing in detail with the aid of graphs, 3 equilibrium positions for the firm under perfect market. Number 2 would be discussing in detail with or without graphs the monopoly. Either you discuss equilibrium positions for the monopoly or you discuss characteristics of the market structure. And then the third one will be discussing in detail the behavior of oligopolists. And then number 4 will be compare and contrast market structures. It can be monopoly and monopolistic, or monopolistic and perfect market, or perfect market and the oligopoly, or oligopoly and the monopolistic. And then the next one will be discussing in detail reasons for the market failure or factors that lead to the misallocation of resources in the market. And then the last one will be discussing in detail consequences with or without graphs, consequence of market failure as a state intervention. Then we go straight to economic issues. Your question number 6 would be amongst the following essays. The first one will be discussing in detail consequences of inflation. Second one will be discussing in detail measures to combat inflation. The third one will be discussing in detail benefits of tourism. The fourth one will be discussing in detail effects of tourism. The fifth one will be discussing state intervention to ensure environmental sustainability or to ensure sustainable development. And the fifth one will be discussing in detail international problems to environmental sustainability. That will be your question 6. So be prepared. Remember, besides seeing you today, I will see you on the 10th of September, where I will be preparing for our paper 1. And then on the 24th also, we'll be preparing for our paper 2. So remember, these dates are very important for you. On the next lesson, I will simply give you details on our examination that is also coming in few weeks after our preparatory examination. Lesson objectives. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to do the following. Mention and describe different types of inflation. Briefly discuss inflation targeting. Briefly discuss causes of inflation. Briefly discuss causes of demand pull and cost push inflation. Discussing in detail consequences of inflation. Discussing in detail measures to combat inflation. This is the lesson body. So we are dealing with the types of inflation as the first section of our lesson, which will be contributing the minimum of 1 mark to the maximum of 10 marks. Inflation targeting in South Africa, which can be 1 mark up to 10 marks if it comes as an additional part or maybe a data response. And then causes of inflation. That's when now it's from the minimum of 1 mark to the maximum of 10 marks. It depends in which section it comes. Effects of inflation, that is the minimum of 1 mark to the maximum of 40 marks. And then remember, effects are also consequences. Measures to combat inflation, minimum of 1 mark to the maximum of 40 marks. So our lesson is divided into 5 sections today. Then there will also be an assessment. So there's a bigger question here. You ask yourself, why are you doing inflation topic? Why should you know about inflation topic? Why should the household know about inflation? Why should the government know about inflation? And why should businesses know about inflation? Remember, if we talk about the inflation, we refer to the significant increase in general price level over a period of time. So why should you basically know about inflation? You have to know about the inflation because we know that inflation is so much attached in the cost of living. If ever the inflation changes, the cost of living will be changing and also the cost of production will be changing. So it is important for businesses to be fully informed about the inflation so that they can be able to make proper decisions, especially if they have inflated expectations. If they expect inflation to be high, they need to make some good decision that will favor themselves in the near future. If they expect inflation to decrease or to be lower, they also have to make a proper decisions in there so that they can safeguard their investments. What about the household? It is important for the household to know more about inflation so that they will be able to make proper decisions about their money. So if ever they are expecting high level of inflation to occur in the near future, they can adjust it and try to spend more now and to avoid spending later when their money is having less buying power. And then also, if they expect inflation to drop or to decrease in the near future, they can save their money now and spend it at the time where it can afford more goods and services. Because inflation has a huge impact on the buying power parity or purchasing power parity of money. Should the inflation rate increases, that will mean there will be a decrease in buying power or purchasing power parity of money. That means you will be affording less goods and services with the inflation increasing. But should the inflation decrease, you will then be affording more goods and services. Now the question is, why should the government know about the inflation? It is important about the government and policymakers to be fully informed about the inflation, because should inflation, should they expect a high level of inflation? That simply means they need to make proper decisions on adjustments in the economy. Inflation affects the national budget and provincial budget, including municipal budget. Also, inflation affects the cost of living, which is also affecting the government, because remember, government is there to ensure price stability and reducing economic inequalities, also pushing more economic growth. So if ever the state is not fully informed about the inflation, it cannot easily achieve its own public sector or macroeconomic objective, because they are too much linked to the inflation. Look, we want to achieve full employment as the government. Can we achieve that with high level of inflation? No, we cannot, because as we want to achieve full employment with high level of inflation, that means firms will be employing relatively less workers, and then that will lead to high level of retrenchment in the workplace. Number two, we want to achieve economic growth. Can we achieve economic growth with excessive inflation? No ways, we cannot achieve economic growth with high level of inflation, because high inflation or price instability affect economic activities. If ever prices are too high, people tend to demand less goods and services. Investors will be reluctant to invest in the country, because the environment won't be good for investments. So the government have to be fully informed about inflation for those reasons. Also, if ever the state want to achieve the price stability, then there must be no increase in inflation that is reckless. If the state want to achieve economic equity, that simply means prices must be reasonable in a way that everyone can afford to participate in the economy or in economic mainstream without any restrictions or discrimination based on the pricing of goods and services. And then we want to achieve exchange rate stability. For that reason, we need to ensure that we don't have excessively high inflation. So it is important for the state and policymakers to be fully informed about inflation and its effects, so that proper decisions can be made. We know that if ever inflation is too high, that creates social instability and economic instability. If we talk about social instability, we refer to the high level of crime, lower level of living standards. So we find people living under poverty or even absolute poverty, because they cannot afford their basic needs. It is therefore important for the government to make proper decisions. So the government, whenever it plans the national budget, it has to use indicators related to the inflation, money supply, as well as also interest rates, so that a proper decision can be made on the allocation of funds and resources to the public. And then, knowing that will guide you better to understand the main thing about the inflation. So if we talk about the inflation concept, we refer to the significant or sustained increase in the general price level over a period of time. Normally, we talk about the year. So for inflation to occur, prices must increase continuously, not just at once. They must increase continuously, so that you can regard that one as an inflation. That's why we say it's a significant or sustained increase in the general price level. And then the increase in price should be across all goods and services, not limited to certain goods and services. All economic sectors must be affected in that case. Then we can say we have an inflation. And then the increase in inflation decreases purchasing power parity of money. We know that once inflation increases, the buying power of money will be decreasing, meaning people will be affording less goods and services with the money in their pockets. That simply tells you that as inflation increases, the value of money decreases, or inflation erodes money from the pocket of the consumer. You find that you are saving that particular 2,000 for the period of 2 years in your pocket, only to find that in the next 2 years, the 2,000 rand won't be affording the same quantity of goods and services you can afford now. Why? It is because the money loses its purchasing power or buying power as it remains in the pocket, due to the fact that prices increase continuously. Every year, the level of pricing increases, the cost of living increases, and the cost of production increases, which also cause inflation. And then money we have tend to afford less goods and services than previously because of the inflation or the significant in general price level or significant increase in general price level. The decrease in purchasing power is notable on consumers' basket as they buy goods and services with the same amount of money after a certain period. You find that you use 2,000 rand to buy the grocery at home. So after 2 years, that 2,000 rand won't be affording the same amount of goods and services. Even after a year, it won't be affording the same amount of goods and services, meaning there must be some sacrifices for you as a household so that you can be able to afford the same quantity, the same brands of goods and services used to afford on the previous year. Why? It is because as the inflation increase or as the prices increase continuously, the money will be losing its purchasing power, so the money will be eroding in the pocket. Then people tend to afford less goods and services. Same thing applies with the production side. Whenever the cost of production increases, firms find it expensive to produce more goods and services. Then for that reason, they sacrifice and produce less, which tend to the increase in prices as they try to offset the burden of cost to the consumer. The purchasing power parity. So you can see this is the year. This was 2022. When we are buying goods and services on this basket or this trolley, you are affording luxury goods and services, even maybe let's say durable, semi-durable, and non-durable with the lower amount of money. And then we go further to 2023. Then you can see that the buying power of money has decreased. We are no longer affording the same basket of goods and services. We are affording relatively less, and there's even more compromises here because your money has lost its buying power. It is no longer affording the same quantity of goods and services. It has been eroded by the increase in inflation or increase in general price level. Let's look at 2024. In 2024, it's even worse. You can see that we are no longer affording the same basket of goods and services. We are affording relatively less. Now we are only affording food stuff with the same amount of money that you used to spend to afford these goods that are luxurious. So that simply tells you that year after year, the money we have in the pocket will never be able to afford the same quantity of goods and services. What you can afford with 3,000 rand now cannot be able to afford those. 3,000 cannot be able to afford the same quantity of goods the following year or even after 2 years. That simply means as the year passes, the level of pricing increases and people tend to afford less goods and services, meaning the cost of living keep on increasing every year. That's a challenge we are having. So this is our 2024. Inflation targeting. We know that the inflation target in South Africa is between 3 to 6% as set by South African Reserve Bank in year 2002. Why did the Reserve Bank intervene by setting inflation targeting? It wanted to ensure that it can be able to have a control over the increase in prices, because if ever there is no inflation targeting, then they will just be saying inflation is under control, while they know that inflation is beyond control. If there is no target that has been set, there is lack of accountability on the South African Reserve Bank. With the inflation targeting, it improved the level of accountability for South African Reserve Bank to keep inflation within that agreed target range. So if it's between 3 to 6%, the minimum is 3%. It should not be decreasing below 3%. The maximum is 6%. Should not be increasing above 6%. If ever the inflation goes below 3%, the Reserve Bank and the government must intervene by trying to cause inflation, because if ever we have that thing that is called a deflation, that simply means consumers will be benefiting in the short run, but producers will be affected negatively because they have produced their goods at the higher cost, but now they have to sell them at the lower cost because of deflation. What about the inflation above the target range of 6%? In that situation, that means a problem, because should the inflation increase above 6%, that means the prices have increased recklessly and beyond the target. That means the buying power of money has decreased, has decreased rapidly, meaning people are now affording relatively less goods and services that can trigger poverty easily, because if people can not even afford their basic needs, that means they find themselves living within absolute poverty. So inflation target is the inflation range for which inflation must not exceed or go below. Remember, it should not exceed 6%, should not go below 3%. So So South African inflation target is between 3 to 6%. This was set to ensure accountability for South African Reserve Bank and the government, ensuring that prices are within the target range and are stable enough to attract more investors. Remember, if we don't have inflation target range, that simply means it will be difficult for investors to invest in South African economy because they cannot trust the inflation of the country. It can simply creep and go beyond 6% up to maybe 20%. Then we will say everything is still fine, while investors will then be pushed away by that economic condition. It is therefore important for investors to be assured by that inflation targeting, to say, look, we invite you to come and invest in South Africa. Our inflation target is between 3 to 6%. So if ever it goes above 6%, we intervene as South African Reserve Bank to combat inflation. If it's below 3%, we increase inflation so that there will also be increase in prices for you to gain as an investor. So inflation targeting is important for the nation because it gives guarantees to investors, households, businesses, and the government to be certain about the country's economic activities and their investment have better returns. Inflation target helps the central bank to easily monitor and stabilize inflation rate. If inflation rate is above 6%, restrictive intervention is necessary by the government and the central bank of the country to combat that inflation. If inflation rate decreases below 3%, expansionary measures are taken by both government and central bank to cause inflation if ever it decreases below what we call the 3%. So inflation target continues. The inflation target is the ideal inflation range for inflation to move within. So it cannot jump the border. It moves within that target to ensure that there's a price stability. The inflation target is like the fence, and the inflation is the children who should play within the area. Occasionally, the children jump the fence, but the Southern Reserve Bank tries to bring the children back into the fence area. So that simply means within that particular family, you are allowed to play outside the house, but within the yard. Should you jump the yard and play outside the yard, that simply tells you that the inflation has gone beyond 6%. Then you are allowed to play within the yard, not inside the house. Should you come and play inside the house, that simply means inflation has decreased to be below the 3%. And then currently the inflation rate is 3%. It is within the target range of between 3 to 6% in South Africa. So remember, interest rate is the main instrument that is used by South African Reserve Bank to control inflation. Basically, the Reserve Bank is using monetary policy. Within the monetary policy, there's a monetary policy committee that consists of 7 executive members that include the governor of the Reserve Bank. Those people meet 6 times a year, where they review every 2 months. They review changes in consumer price index or CPI, which will be informing them about the possible increase or decrease in the inflation. If ever they see that inflation will be increasing rapidly, they use interest rate to try and reduce that particular inflation. If they see that inflation is too low, it's below the target range, also they use interest rate to ensure that inflation increases. On the previous meeting, the MPC met and decreased repo rate by 0.25 basis points. That simply means they were trying to cause inflation because inflation rate was 2.8 to 2.9%. So they try to ensure that they increase money supply, allowing people to hold on more money and demand more goods and services, which could then increase what we call the demand pull inflation. Now, measuring inflation. How do we measure inflation? Inflation is measured through indexes. So indexes are used to measure changes in general price level within the economy. Then those indexes include the consumer price index, which is CPI, as well as the producer price index. We know that CPI measures the basket of goods and services for average South Africans. The CPI is calculated every month to see the possible changes in the inflation rate. And the CPI figures that are calculated in a monthly basis inform the MPC on how repo rate can be adjusted to ensure that we combat or cause inflation. So the consumer price index measures the cost of living for consumers. It is not focused on the production, it is focused on what we call on the cost of living for consumers. CPI consists of consumer goods and services. So inside the basket of CPI, we have the likes of consumer goods and services, we have the likes of value-added tax, we have the likes of interest rates. We also have the prices of imported consumer goods and services. But in the basket of CPI, we don't have we don't have capital goods, because CPI is for the consumer, so there are no capital goods or equipment in there. There is no value-added tax and also interest rates. We continue. It excludes capital and intermediate goods. A value-added tax is included, and then interest rate and price of imported goods are explicitly shown, meaning they're indicated or they're included in the basket of CPI or consumer price index. Then we have the producer price index as a part of indexes. Remember, it measures the cost of production for businesses. So that's a PPI. PPI pertains the following. There are capital goods and intermediate goods. Remember, capital goods are used to produce goods and services by firms. So for that reason, they are the part of the basket for the PPI. And then we have services. Services are not included in the basket of PPI. We only have capital goods. Consumer goods also are not the part of the PPI. And then imported capital goods are the part of the PPI, because capital goods are used to produce goods and services. But imported consumer goods are not the part of what we call of the PPI. Then value-added tax is excluded, is not the part of what we call the producer price index. We continue with weighting. If we talk about weighting, we are referring to the comparison between two goods or services based on their value or monetary value. Maybe you find that one is selling the car, one is selling the house. I mean, it depends on the value for both of those items. You find that the house is 3 million, the car is 500,000. How many times can the car be multiplied to get to the value of the house? That's what we call the weighting. We weigh the value or monetary value of two goods or services. So to overcome the problem of differences in the importance of an item in an index, a weighted index number makes the figure directly comparable. The weight reflects the relative importance of an item. So if food is given the weight of 30% and house is given the value of 15%, it means that a change in the price of food is twice as important as the change in the price of the housing. Then we talk about inflation rate. So this is when now we calculate inflation. Remember, inflation rate refers to the ratio of inflation as calculated per annum using the CPI. So the inflation rate can be calculated as soon as the consumer price index has been calculated. We cannot calculate inflation rate without having what we call the consumer price index. Inflation is always expressed as an annual rate, or meaning it's calculated per year, not per month. And then the most common practice is to compare the index of the particular month with the index of the corresponding month in the previous year on a year-to-year basis. The result is then expressed as a percentage increase or decrease of the inflation. And then we continue with inflation rate. So the index of a particular month can be compared to the index of the previous month within the same year. For example, a month-to-month basis. For instance, we can say to calculate the inflation, let's say we use a year-to-year. We can use the index for July and maybe August. Maybe the CPI for July, maybe it was 123. The one for August was maybe 124. That means inflation has increased. But should the CPI for July maybe be 124 and CPI for August maybe is 115, inflation has decreased in that case. It is often also, compared on the quarter-to-quarter basis, where current quarter is compared to the previous quarter. Remember the quarter? We spoke about that one on our previous lessons. And then inflation rate, so we have the rate here, equal to CPI for the current year minus CPI for the previous year, over the CPI for the previous year multiplied by 100. So remember, some can say CPI for the current year over minus CPI for the base year. Remember, our base year in South Africa, our current base year is 2015 prices. But it can happen that we are not given the base year, we are given the previous year, year-to-year, 2023 figures and 2024 figures. What is your current year? Is 2024 figures. What is your previous year? Is 2023 figures. Then you must be able to substitute and calculate. Then we continue measuring inflation. This is an example of measuring inflation. Remember, our inflation rate is between 3 to 6%. Assume that CPI for 2021 was 110 and CPI for 2022 was 125. Calculate inflation rate for 2022. Show all calculations. That's when we go. There's a formula. CPI for 2022 minus CPI for 2021 over CPI for 2021 multiplied by 100. Then let's look at the substitution. We say it's 125 for 2022 minus 110 for 2021 over 110 multiplied by 100. That gives us then 15 over 110 multiplied by 100. Then we get 13.63. That's our inflation rate, which is above the target rate of between 3 to 6%. One must intervene by combating this inflation. We continue with another example. Then CPI for 2023 was 118, and then for 2024 was 123. Then calculate the inflation rate, show all calculations. I think this one is for 2024. It's 2024. Then let's look. So CPI 2024 minus CPI 2023 over 2023 multiplied by 100. Substitute 123 minus 118 divided by 118 multiplied by 100. What do we get? We continue to get maximum marks. We continue with the step. We get 5 over 118 multiplied by 100. Inflation rate is 4.23. So it's within the target range of between 3 to 6%. So that's how we calculate inflation. This can give you up to how many marks? 4 marks in calculation if you are given the data response. It is important for you also to be able to use this question maybe for 8 marks. For instance, they can give you CPI figures for 2 years and say, advise maybe the governor of Reserve Bank on how it can use interest rate on the above inflation rate. What is the first thing to do? You must calculate your inflation rate. After getting your inflation rate, you measure if it's between 3 to 6%. If it's between 3 to 6%, there is no need for the Reserve Bank to intervene by combating inflation or causing inflation. But if inflation that you get on calculation is above 6%, there must be intervention with using restrictive measures to combat inflation as for the fiscal policy. But inflation is, if inflation is below 3%, there must be expansionary intervention using monetary policy to cause the inflation rate. And then now we are moving to the second segment of the topic, which is the types of inflation. Here we have what we call the consumer inflation. So if we talk about the consumer inflation, you refer to the sustained increase in general price level of goods and services that consumers pay for, in the economy for their goods and services. So it affects consumers. So consumer inflation includes the following: the headline inflation or the CPI inflation. If we talk about the headline inflation, we refer to the inflation rate that has not been adjusted. It contains the effect of mortgage bond or interest rates. So it is measured through CPI and reflects the cost of basket for goods and services purchased by the household. Headline inflation is also known as the CPI inflation. And then headline inflation is unadjusted. It includes the effect of mortgage bond or the interest rate. That is the first one. We call that one the CPI or headline inflation. The second one is CPIX inflation. If we talk about the CPIX inflation, we refer to the inflation that has been adjusted. So CPI inflation refer to the adjusted CPI, which exclude the effect of mortgage bonds. If we talk about the CPIX does not include the effect of interest rate or mortgage bond. That simply tells you that CPIX inflation is always lower than the CPI inflation. Why? Because CPIX has been adjusted while CPI has not been adjusted. The core inflation. So if we talk of the core inflation, we refer to the inflation that exclude goods and services with highly volatile prices. If we talk about volatility, we refer to prices that are inconsistent. They can increase or decrease anytime. So we say they are volatile. So it excludes goods with highly volatile prices such as fuel. We know that fuel increases or normally or changes every month or in a monthly basis. And then price of red meat can change in daily basis because there is a scale that is used in there. And then administered inflation. Remember, now we have spoken about two administered inflation or adjusted inflation. It's CPIX, it's a core inflation. Then if we talk about administered inflation, we refer to the inflation that is caused by state intervention through price adjustment. It can be because of price ceiling or price floors. That's when you talk about administered inflation. Administered prices are prices of goods and services that are set by the government or controlled by the government authorities, such as property taxes, sanitation, refuse removal, water, electricity, fuel, and paraffin, etc. Those prices, whenever they increase, they cause what we call administered inflation, because these prices are controlled or influenced by the government intervention in the market. The producer inflation. So this is the inflation where there is a sustained increase in prices for cost of production over a period of time. This talks about the cost of production, because if you talk about producer inflation, we are affecting producers or businesses as they produce goods and services. Then producer inflation is measured by the producer price index, which is known as the PPI. All-inclusive inflation. So it is the inflation calculated for the economy as the whole based on the GDP deflator. GDP deflator is a measure of the inflation against the specific base year, and it is used to convert GDP at current prices to the GDP at the constant prices. Remember, if we talk about the GDP at current prices, we mean GDP figures that have not been adjusted for inflation. But if we talk about GDP at constant prices, we refer to GDP figures that have been adjusted for inflation. So if we convert GDP at current price to GDP at constant prices, we mean in that situation we are doing what we call a GDP deflator. We are deflating GDP figures by removing the inflation rate. GDP at current prices refer to the GDP figures that have not been adjusted for inflation. There is an effect of inflation. While GDP at constant prices, they've been adjusted for inflation. Inflation effect has been removed to discover the actual growth of economic activities in the country. The hyperinflation. If we talk about the hyperinflation, we mean the extremely increase in general price level over a period of time that can increase up to 50% and even above. What causes this inflation? This inflation is caused by the rapid increase in money supply in a way that money loses its buying power. In that situation, investors, businesses, government lose interest about the country's economy because the money of the country is valueless. It means that inflation is out of control and its level is not predictable, and is also called runaway inflation rate. If ever we talk about hyperinflation, we mean a runaway inflation whereby the money will be valueless. We come across people carrying bags just to buy a loaf of bread because there's more money supply printed by the government, which results to this kind of the inflation. When price levels increase so rapidly that people lose confidence in the value of money, it can be difficult for the economy to operate. Hyperinflation is usually accompanied by an increase in money supply that will result in the currency of the country becoming practically worthless. So the money of the country will be worthless because of what we call the hyperinflation. Then stagflation. In this case, we talk about the increase in inflation that is accompanied by lower level of economic growth as well as high level of unemployment rate. In inflation that prevails when there is a lower level of economic growth, high unemployment rate, and high level of inflation, we say that is stagflation. So that means there's a stagflation. It is stagnating there in the economy, meaning that we are pressed. The state is intervening or has intervened by decreasing money supply, by decreasing or let's say implementing restrictive monetary and fiscal policies, which has led to relatively less money supply, causing lower level of employment rate and high level of high level of unemployment as well as lower level of economic growth, while at the same time we have high level of inflation, which is known as basically the cost push inflation. That kind of the inflation which exists in there is the cost push inflation, is not based on the demand because people are not having enough money to spend. For that reason, it's a cost push inflation that can be caused by maybe the depreciation of the currency, maybe high profit margins by businesses, maybe high wage demand by workers, etc. That will be explained as we go forward. We talk about the deflation. If we talk of deflation, we mean the significant decrease in general price level over a period of time. So that means inflation rate is decreasing rapidly in a way that it goes below 3% as for South Africa. Remember, deflation is dangerous. It's good for consumers, but it's bad for producers because for consumers, they tend to afford more goods and services, meaning their money will be having an increased purchasing power, buying power. However, for producers, it's a bad thing because for the stock that has already been produced, they will have to sell it at the lower cost while they produce at the higher cost. That will result into them incurring economic loss within the economy. So we talk about also disinflation. If we talk of the disinflation, we talk about the increase in the inflation rate at the decreasing rate. So inflation rate does increase, but increasing at the decreasing rate compared to the previous year. We call that a disinflation. It doesn't mean there is no inflation. There is inflation, but inflation is increasing at the decreasing rate compared to the previous year. For instance, we can check that maybe in 2023, inflation rate was 7.4%, but in 2024, inflation in 2023, inflation increased from 6% to 7.4%. From 6% to 7.4%. But in 2024, inflation increased from 7.4% to 7.6%. You can see that inflation indeed is increasing, but it increased with 0.2% compared to the previous year, where it increased by 0.4%. Then we call that one a disinflation. Then we move to the third part of our lesson, which is known as characteristics of inflation or causes of inflation, where what we call the demand pull inflation. If we talk about the demand pull inflation, we mean the inflation that occurs when the demand, or let's say the aggregate demand, increases faster than the aggregate supply in a way that producers find it difficult to match the demand of goods and services in the economy. That causes the demand pull inflation. So there's more money in this situation chasing few goods. For that reason, so if there's more money chasing few goods, that pushes producers to increase their prices, which will be causing the demand pull inflation. So the demand pull inflation occurs when aggregate demand increases faster than aggregate supply, meaning the aggregate supply cannot increase in a way that it can match the increase in the demand for goods and services. It is a result of too much money chasing few goods in the economy. The increase in aggregate supply can be a mechanism to reverse the effect of this inflation. However, if the supply cannot be able to meet this demand, then there will be a demand pull inflation. Groups responsible for demand pull inflation include consumers, businesses, government, and the foreign sector. Consumers, if ever they have more money, they normally demand more goods and services. They spend recklessly, which can cause inflation. And then also, businesses, if ever business is creating even more job opportunities, that will mean there's more money flow in the economy. Then people will be having more money and demand more goods and services. The government, if ever the state intervenes by spending, by maybe increasing its spending in the economy, by increasing government spending and decreasing taxes, this can lead to what we call the demand pull inflation. Also in the foreign sector, if ever we have maybe what we call the appreciated currency, that simply means our currency becomes too strong in a way that we spend reckless on imported goods and services because we can afford more. The cause of demand pull inflation. So firstly, increase in consumer spending. Sorry about that. So if consumers are spending more in the economy, it can happen that consumers are spending more but supply is still high. So should the consumers demand more than what can be supplied, that can cause the demand pull inflation. What causes consumers to demand more is the increase in money supply, increase in borrowings and lending, decrease in repo rate, decrease in taxes. That can lead to consumers demanding relatively more goods and services. Investment spending. If ever investment spending increase in the economy by businesses, that will mean there's more money flow and more job opportunities in the economy. Remember, with more job, there's more money flow and more demand for goods and services. Government spending. If the state intervened by increasing its spending on improving infrastructure, increasing job opportunities, or increasing what we call wage and salaries for employees, that will mean in that particular economy there is more money flow and more demand for goods and services. Should the demand increase more than the supply, there will be demand pull inflation. Foreign earnings. If ever we have more earnings on our investments that are coming from abroad, more earnings on exported goods and services, there will be more national income in South Africa, which can lead to more money flow. As there is more money flow, there will be more demand for goods and services and more economic opportunities. Reduction in taxes. Should the state intervene by reducing taxation in South African economy, that allows households to hold on more money, that allows households to afford more goods and services. As they demand more goods and services because of lower taxes, remember, they have more disposable income, then they are always tempted to spend. They will demand more goods in a way that the demand increases more than the supply, which will be causing the demand pull inflation. Accessible credit. If ever the Reserve Bank intervened by decreasing repo rate, that will simply indicate that people are having more access to money flow in the economy. As more access to money supply, that simply tells you that people will be demanding more goods and services. So for that reason, that can result to the demand increasing more than the supply and cause inflation. More money supply. If ever the Reserve Bank intervened by decreasing repo rate, decreasing credit reserves, buying bonds from the open market and relaxing moral persuasion, that will simply tell you that there will be more money supply. As there is more money supply in the economy, consumers are always tempted to spend. They will spend money by demanding excessively more goods and services, only to find that those goods are not available. Why I'm saying they're not available? Our market is unable to meet the demand. They have supply constraints. If they have supply challenges, they cannot afford to produce goods that are demanded by our consumers. For that reason, that can cause the demand pull inflation. Less savings. If ever our consumers are saving less and spending more, that will lead to the demand increasing more than the supply in the economy and cause inflation. Appreciated currency. If ever our currency appreciates, it gains more value compared to other foreign currencies. For that reason, that can cause our consumers to afford relatively more goods and services from abroad, and that can cause what we call an inflation that is known as the demand pull inflation, while reducing what we call a cost push inflation, because if the currency appreciates, imported capital goods will be becoming more cheap for South African firms. As they become cheap, local firms will then be producing at the lower cost than previously, and that will be reducing the cost push inflation. This is the demand pull inflation graph. So originally we have our AD, we have our AS, and also we have what we call the E as equilibrium. The price is P and quantity is Q. Then let's check what happens after. There is the increase in demand caused by maybe a decrease in taxes, decrease in savings, increase in government spending, increase in consumption spending, more level of income, more government spending, the currency appreciates, there are more foreign earnings. All of those things will be resulting in demand shifting from left to the right. You can see the demand move from 80 to 81. What does that mean if the supply is not responding to the increase in demand? Then you can see the prices increasing from P to P1. There you see the price that increased from P to P1 because the supply is not responding to the increase in demand. That simply means the economic condition is favoring who? Is favoring consumers over producers. Producers are unable to produce and meet the supply as it increases. So there you go, you come across the quantity demanded increased from Q to Q1, but the quantity supplied doesn't change, it remains at Q. The graph illustrates an increase in the aggregate demand from 80 to 81 and the single aggregate supply, which is not changing. You can see that the demand is increasing from 80 to 81, but the supply remains the same. And then we continue. And the aggregate demand increased to it increased to AD. What happens? The price level of and production output will also increase until full employment is reached. The initial increase in demand will have a positive influence on the production, employment, and income. But when full capacity is reached, further increase in demand will lead to the prices increases. So this simply tells you that as the demand increases, firms will be increasing also their production capacity to meet the supply. But when they reach the maximum capacity of production, they have utilized all of their factors of production, businesses. They cannot increase further their output while the demand keep on increasing. That simply means that there will be increase in prices or the demand pull inflation. Let's check again. We'll continue. What is the monetary's view on inflation? Monetarists believe that inflation is caused by the increase in money supply in the economy. Yes, so be able to answer the question when they say briefly discuss monetarists' view on the inflation. It is caused by the increase in the money supply when the money will be increasing more and chasing few goods. They have a view that the increase in money supply will cause increase in aggregate demand of goods and services in the economy. Yes, that's a fact. And then an increase in demand without the simultaneous increase in the aggregate supply will cause existing suppliers wanting more money for their goods and services as the demand exceeds the supply for goods and services. So they will then decide to increase their prices because they see that their goods are on demand and they cannot afford to produce even more. They then increase their prices. So in this case, consumers are willing to pay more. Then we move to the cost push inflation. So remember, the cost push inflation referred to general increase in prices caused by the increase in the cost of the factor inputs. There we talk about factors of production increases. The cost of production factors increases. Those are our factor inputs. Inefficiencies are happening as well as the shoplifting. If we talk about inefficiencies, we mean when firms are producing by wasting resources. If we talk about the shoplifting, we talk about the theft or looting that can happen in the market, whereby firms find themselves being docked of their goods and services without being compensated or without being paid for. For that reason, when they return back, they will be increasing their cost of goods and services to offset the burden to the consumer so that they can recover whatever loss they incurred in the previous year or previous month. Remember looting that happened back then during the COVID-19. It is caused by the supply side of the economy, since prices increase as a direct result of the rise in production costs. So the cost push inflation is mainly based on the increase in the cost of production. Should the cost of production for firms increase, that will be causing the cost push inflation. These are the causes of cost push inflation. Firstly, we talk about the key inputs. Here we talk about factors of production. If factors of production costs are increasing, that simply means the cost of production will be increasing, and that will be causing the cost push inflation. How does it happen? Producers will then, if they see that cost of labor is too high, cost of natural resources is too high, cost of capital is too high, what do? They then increase the cost of the final output to the consumer to offset their burden to the consumer, so that they can prevent having what we call an economic loss. Wages and salaries. If ever there's a high wage demand in the market, what happens? Producers might give workers their wages and salaries that they need as an increase. However, to recover that cost of labor, what do? They increase the cost of the output to the consumer. Depreciated currency. If ever the currency depreciates, that means it loses the value, meaning our imported capital goods will appear more expensive in South Africa. As they appear expensive, that simply means the cost of production on capital for producers will be high. So what are they going to do to avoid making a loss? They will increase the final output to be faced to the or transferred to the consumer. Profit margins. If ever profit target for producers are too high, that is done at the expense of the consumer. That simply means as they target to achieve excessively high profit, they will then have to increase their prices. As they increase their prices, they affect the what we call the consumer. Low productivity. If ever in the market there's a lower productivity while the cost of production is too high and the remuneration per worker is too high, that is accompanied by inflation. Natural disasters. If ever you come across an issue of the drought or maybe flood, that simply tells you, or the earthquake can affect the productivity. That simply means there will be a lower productivity available, and firms will be finding it difficult to invest. They will be increasing the cost of production for them, and that will be causing what we call the increase in prices. For instance, if ever there's a drought, firms will be having less water available to irrigate their plants. So they will have to find alternative ways to produce or to irrigate their plants. So for that reason, what is going to happen? They will be increasing what we call the final price of the final output to the consumer to gain more, because they've spent a lot to produce through irrigation system. Shoplifting or theft. If ever there's a shoplifting or looting or theft in the market, producers are not always willing to accept the loss. What do? To recover the cost, they always increase the price to the consumer. Remember, after the looting that happened some years ago, what did they do, the producers? When they came back into the market, they increased prices. So that rapid increase in prices in the economy was what we call the cost push inflation, not the demand pull inflation, because people had less income, people were unemployed. So for that reason, the inflation that incurred at the time was the cost push inflation. High corporate tax. If ever the company tax or the tax for businesses is too high, that increases the cost of production for businesses. As the cost of production for businesses increases, what do to maintain their profits? They offset that burden of the cost of tax to the consumer by increasing their selling prices. Increase in labor costs. Should labor costs increase as a part of factors of production, that means the production costs become too expensive, or the cost of doing business become relatively too high. And then what can they do to ensure ensure that they keep up with their profits. They offset that burden to the consumer, and then increase in price of imported inputs. If ever the price of capital goods that are imported are very, very high, that means our firms will be producing at the higher cost. For that reason, what are they going to do? They will then try to ensure that they avoid economic loss by increasing the prices of their final outputs to affect the consumer. That will be the cost push inflation. Also, the one that is left out, the increase in the interest rate to whom? To the producer. If ever producers are borrowing the capital from financial institutions at the higher interest rate, that means they will be affected negatively, because for them to be able to keep on paying those high interest rates on their machines that they've been bought with the borrowed capital, they have to increase the selling price, which will be affecting the consumer. So in that case, that will be causing the cost push inflation. This is the graph indicating the cost push inflation. AD as usual, A as there, and then we have equilibrium as E, price and the quantity. Then we have the supply declining. Supply is shifting from AS to AS1, from right to the left. As that happens, what do we see? Then we have the new equilibrium on your left now, from right to the left, being E1, and then the price is increasing from P to P1. Then the quantity supply decrease from Q to Q1. So you can see that consumers are demanding more, but supply is declining. What is causing the decrease in supply? All of these factors I've mentioned can cause the decrease in supply. Number one, increase in company tax can result to increase in cost of production and decrease supply. Number two, increase in interest rates for businesses can lead to them producing at the higher cost, and then for that reason, they will be producing less because the payable returns to commercial banks are too high while businesses are producing at the higher cost. And then also we talk about maybe the likes of theft or shoplifting. If ever there's theft, that means the level of output will be less than at the time. If ever there's less output, possibility is the supply in the market will be decreasing because of shoplifting. And then there's a lot we can come, and we've already counted. So what happened? That increases the price rapidly to go up there. And then let's check. Cost push inflation is reflected in the upward shift of the AS curve. You can see this one. And then an increase in the cost of production result in the decrease in the supply. If ever the cost of production increases, supply decreases from left to the right. From right to the left. You can see it's decreasing. And then when the supply decreases, it results in the higher prices and lower level of production and income. Remember, the supply declines, it pushes prices up. And then cost push inflation has a negative impact on the production, income, and employment. High prices make goods and services less affordable, which means less are sold and produced. This causes lower employment levels. And then now we move. The second last part of our lesson is consequences of inflation or effects of inflation. Let's check. The inflation has a variety of impact in the economy and the society. It does not always affect, or it's not always affect the economy, it's also affect the society. For instance, we will check. As inflation increases above its target, what will happen to maybe debtors and borrowers? Debtors will benefit at the expense of borrowers, because when they borrow money while it can afford more goods and services. As they pay back in installments, maybe the period can be 5 to 10 years, it will then be affording less goods and services, because inflation keep on increasing year after year. Unless interest rates are increasing at the higher rate than the inflation rate, then there can be benefit to creditors. And then what about maybe investors and savers? Those who invest on flexible nominal values will always benefit from inflation, especially if ever the interest rate increases more than the inflation rate. But those that invest on fixed nominal values will lose, especially if the inflation rate increases more than what we call the interest rate that was agreed upon some years ago. Then they will be losing. We talk about maybe employment or unemployment, as well as maybe standard of living and poverty. If ever there's high level of inflation, what happens? The level of demand for goods and services decreases, meaning there will be less labor demand in the economy. As there will be less labor demand, unemployment and retrenchment will be increasing. And then as people find themselves unemployed, that simply means people will not be having income and they won't be affording goods and services. That will mean they will be decreasing or eroded standard of living, and level of poverty will be increasing. What about maybe we talk about inflationary expectation, we talk about in the psychological influence. If ever people are expecting inflation to increase in the near future, what do? They simply decide to spend now in large capacity. There will be a panic spending in the economy because people want to buy or use their money while it can still afford more goods and services. What if they expect inflation to decrease? What do? They save their money now and spend it at the later stage when the money can afford relatively more goods and services. So what about wages and salaries earners? We know that there are people that are receiving stable income consecutively in their workplaces. If that happens, that means as inflation increases, their money keep on losing its buying power, and then they tend to afford relatively less goods and services. We also talk about taxpayers. If ever inflation increases, there will be possibility of the increase in what we call in the wage level for workers. So they normally negotiate their wages and salaries so that they can maintain their living standard. So as their negotiations are going on, it can happen that their wages and salaries are increasing. As they increase, they can move the taxpayer from a lower tax bracket to the higher tax bracket, meaning it can lead to bracket creeping. As that happens, you find that the increase in income does not compensate for the increase in the inflation. So the level of living standard is compromised because of that upward adjustment. So let's check. Debtors, borrowers receive money with higher buying power and paying back while it can afford less goods and services. Borrowers benefit from price increase. During the period of rising prices, debtors gain in real terms because the contract was signed in advance and cannot be changed. Debtors receive the money with relatively high purchasing power and repay it back or those loans with low purchasing power unless interest rates are sufficient to prevent the situation. Those are debtors. Creditors. Creditors will be losing. These are lenders. So creditors will suffer due to the price increases because they get money back which has lower purchasing power, especially if the interest rate has been below the inflation rate. Inflation harms creditors as they lose due to the fall of real value of money. When they give money away as loans, they give money with more buying power and get it back with less buying power. Changes in the price levels affect debtors and creditors different at the different time or periods. We continue. Salary and wages earners. So price increase affect people negatively because their income are relatively fixed. Real wages fall sharply during period of high inflation, meaning they tend to afford less goods and services as a result of a decline in capital stock and the shift in relative prices. Inflation can impoverish large segments of population by eroding their real wages. So when people tend to afford less goods and services with their income, that means there's a decrease in real wages. So people find themselves being in the poverty stage. It can be relative or absolute poverty, which means their living standard will be decreasing. And then we continue. Relative wages, relative wage are the important component of wealth. They constitute the main source of income for many households, especially for the less well off. Then the behavior of real wages therefore has a direct bearing on income distribution and the level of poverty. These groups include the retired people, pensioners, and the poor that will experience erosion of spending power and eventually end too little to survive. Then wage increase are lower than inflation increase. And then we continue. Investors and savers. Assets with a fixed nominal value have a fixed return and lower purchasing power as prices are increasing. Meaning, here, those that are investing on fixed nominal values tend to receive less returns as the inflation changes. Purchasing power is reduced unless the interest rate is above the inflation rate. People who invest in negotiable instruments such as shares often benefit from inflation because during periods of inflation, interest rates are increased to encourage savings, which then benefit those that are investing on shares. We continue. Investors in assets with flexible market value gain when prices increase because their assets with flexible market value increase at least proportionately with the rate of the inflation, due to the fact that as inflation increases, interest rate will also be increasing, so their returns will be increasing because they are adjustable with what we call, they are flexible to change with the change in inflation. Often the prices of these assets increase more rapidly than increase in the general price level of goods and services. So people who save their money for long periods with the aim of using these funds to meet future expectations, these savings may be invested as fixed deposits in the money market, as life policies, or the pension funds. Taxpayers, how are they affected? With inflation, taxpayers' nominal income rise, although their real income remain unchanged, because taxes are levied on the nominal income but not on the real income, as this affects the purchasing power of taxpayers. Taxes are levied on nominal income and not on real income. Let's repeat. If the income tax bracket remain unchanged, inflation increases the average rate of personal income tax. Individuals will have to pay higher taxes even if they are actually not better off than before. Bracket creep leads to a redistribution of income from taxpayers to the government. If ever there is a tax bracket creeping, people are moved from lower tax bracket to the next higher tax bracket, which then takes money from households or workers to the government. Industrial peace. So if ever there's high level of inflation, there will be no industrial peace, because high inflation is accompanied by bargaining as well as mass action if ever firms are not willing to meet demands of their employees and trade unions. These actions can sometimes spill over into violence, which affect the society at large. Inflation leads to the demand for increased wages, or as trade unions put increasing pressure on employers to raise wages and salaries so that living standard for their people can be increased. In extreme conditions or situations, in the presence of exceptionally high inflation, together with a government that is determined not to yield wage increase demand, which can push inflation to even higher levels, widespread civil unrest will follow. If ever the government or firms are unwilling to meet the demand for high wages, high inflation is too high, that can lead to mass actions. After bargaining, it can lead to even further industrial unrest as well as social unrest, because we know that as we protest in the workplaces, that can spill over to the society and lead to maybe social instability. Balance of payments. So if a country's rate of inflation is higher than its trading partners, the prices of exported goods increase while the price of imported will be decreasing. This leads to the less competitive in the export market, leading to a decrease in the exports. Cheap imports have a negative effect on the country's balance of payments. The loss of competitiveness can be a result of increased unemployment. Then we talk about unemployment and poverty. The effect of inflation are uneven because it does not benefit anyone and harms most, some less than others. Inflation also tends to redistribute income from low-income groups to high-income groups, meaning those people that are earning more, we call those people basically the middle class. They are owners of factors of production. They benefit because they collect money from low-income groups, then meaning they make the more returns on their investments. This is because people in low-income groups do not have assets that can rise in the value faster than the rate of the inflation to help them overcome the inflation effects. So the middle class is having those assets that can increase faster as inflation increases. So for that reason, they can benefit when there's high level of inflation, but those that are having low income, they are not having those assets. So as inflation increases, their money will be depleting and affording relatively less goods and services in the economy. Powerful groups such as trade unions, large companies, and wealthy people are able to increase their share of national income at the expense of disadvantaged people such as pensioners and unemployed, as well as welfare recipients. So some can benefit at the expense of others during the high level of inflation. Psychological influence. Here we check low inflationary expectation. If ever we expect that there will be lower inflation, as consumers, businesses, and the government, what can we do? Consumers will save their money now and spend later because they know that their money will be affording more goods and services at the later stage. What about investors? If they expect low level of inflation, what do? And then what about the government? What does the government do if the government expects lower level of inflation? So, limit excessive wage demands by different labor unions, because workers do not expect an increase in cost of living. So there will be less negotiations in wages and salaries if ever they expect less inflation. Allow consumers to postpone their consumption expenditure, thereby reducing pressure on the price so they can spend in future when the inflation will be lower. Give households confidence that inflation rate will be low in future and encourage them to save more from their income, thereby controlling excess demand. Reduce panic buying by consumers when they expect prices that prices will be stable in the near future or will be lower in the near future. Boost real interest rate, which will encourage savings in the economy. Increase the burden on debtors, which discourages them from borrowing money due to real interest rates. We continue. High inflationary expectation. Excessive wage demands by different labor unions. So if ever they expect high level of inflation, they will be bargaining and demanding high wages and salaries and put pressure on businesses and the government to give them reasonable wages and salaries so that they can be in improved living standard. Prompts consumers to engage in panic buying. So they tend to buy more now because they are saving their money from not eroding. If they don't buy now, their money will then afford less goods and services in the near future. And then make households to save less, thereby leading to excess demand for goods and services, which can cause demand pull inflation. Decrease real interest rate, which will discourage savings. Reduce the burden on creditors, as they will receive their money at the higher interest rate. Then approaching the last part of our of the lesson. Remember, the previous one is consequence of inflation. That's an essay where you discuss in detail consequences of inflation. You must be able to list all of those consequences and be able to discuss on each subheading so that you can be able to get marks. Combating inflation, we are talking about discussing in detail measures to combat inflation. Remember, we have a problem. We have inflation as a problem, is an elephant in the house. What does it do? It reduces the buying power parity of money, meaning people afford less and find themselves trapped in the poverty. And then those are the effects. And then what can be done to overcome the issue is for the state and the Reserve Bank to intervene by combating the inflation, combating both the demand pull and the cost push inflation, using both the fiscal measures, monetary measures, and other measures to fight inflation. To combat inflation, restrictive fiscal and monetary policy measures are implemented. Yes, the government and Reserve Bank can use these instruments. That is done to decrease the level of demand in the economy, since too much money chases since there is too much money chasing few goods in the economy. And then the decrease in aggregate demand eases pressure on supply, since the demand decreases to match aggregate demand. So as the supply decreases, the demand decreases to match this aggregate supply, which can reduce inflation. So this is an essay. When you start to define the inflation, inflation refers to the significant or sustained increase in general price level over a period of time. All right, now you start. We use the fiscal policy measures. Those fiscal policy measures are implemented in a restrictive manner or a constructionary manner. So we implement, or government can implement, restrictionary fiscal policy by doing what? On the government spending. By decreasing government spending. Government should cut down its spending by lowering the rates of salaries and cancelling existing infrastructure projects. By doing so, that will be decreasing money flow, employment opportunities, and then the demand for goods and services. Government can decrease borrowings to finance its expenses and cut the budget. That can reduce the quantity of money in circulation. Government, through the central bank, can buy or sell bonds to increase or decrease the availability of cash that can be used for consumption. We continue with the fiscal policy. Taxation. So going back to government spending, there are three components to focus on: decreasing or adjusting down wages and salaries, decreasing government spending in terms of maybe social transfers and provision of public goods, and then decreasing government spending on infrastructure projects that can create job opportunities, that can lower money flow in the economy and decrease the demand for goods and services, which will lower the inflation rate. Taxation, what can be done? Increasing direct taxes such as income tax or personal income tax, property taxes, as well as company tax can decrease disposable income and curb excessive demand. If ever the state intervened by increasing all of these taxes as a part of direct tax, there will be lower disposable income for economic stakeholders, which can lead to less demand for goods and services. Increasing the indirect taxes such as value-added tax and tax on fuel and liquor will increase the cost of living and will reduce the demand because consumers will buy fewer goods and services since they will become relatively expensive. If VAT or indirect tax increases, it increases the selling price and discourage consumers from doing what? From demanding more goods and services. Implementing surcharges on imported goods will curb spending on imported goods and services, meaning having to increase maybe import tariffs and administrative obstacles can result to consumers demanding less of imported goods and services. Then we go to the monetary policy measures. Remember, monetary policy refer to the policy undertaken by central bank to ensure price stability and the economic stability. So price stability is achieved through decreasing money supply in order to reduce the demand for goods and services in the economy. So if we talk about Reserve Bank, you mean we are referring to the money supply in the economy. It is the one or main institution that can affect the money supply in the economy by using monetary policy measures. Central Bank uses Monetary Policy Committee (MPC) to monitor changes in inflation, in CPI and PPI, in order to take relevant measures to keep inflation within the target range so that there can be a good environment for investors. Contractionary monetary policy is implemented, or restrictionary monetary policy is implemented to ensure that inflation rate remains within the target range. Which are those measures? Repo rate. We know that if we talk of repo rate, we refer to the interest rate charged by charged by Reserve Bank to commercial banks on their borrowings. Increasing lending rate, we also call this one a lending rate. It's a repo rate or repurchase rate or lending rate. So it is charged by whom? By the central bank. To whom? To commercial banks on their borrowings. Remember, whenever commercial banks need money, they borrow from whom? From the central bank or Reserve Bank. So those borrowings, on those borrowings, commercial banks are paying what we call the repo rate or repurchase rate or lending rate. These banks would have to charge a high interest rate on loans and overdrafts, making it more expensive for people to borrow money to spend on goods and services. The demand for goods and services will drop or decrease, causing prices to decrease. So let's check. Repo rate will be increasing. If ever repo rate increases, what happens? The credit affordability will decrease. And then that simply means borrowings will be decreasing. And then money supply will decrease. At the same time, money demand will be increasing. As money supply decreases, the aggregate demand will be decreasing, meaning consumers will be demanding relatively less goods and services because they're not having enough money. So as the demand decreases, it can happen to match what we call the aggregate supply. For that reason, the prices will be decreasing. As prices decreases, that will mean inflation rate will also decrease. We call this a chain of events. So for you to understand this better, repo rate or repurchase rate or lending rate will be increased, which will make credit availability to be less or to decrease. And then borrowings will decrease because no one is willing to take a loan when interest rates are too high because they will be paying more. And then money supply will be decreasing, while on the side, money demand will be in. People will be in need of more money while there's less money available. And then the demand for goods and services aggregate will be decreasing. And then the demand will then, as the demand decrease, it can meet the lower supply. As they match, prices of goods will be decreasing, which will cause the decrease in the inflation rate. The cash reserve requirement or reserve requirement ratio. So Reserve Bank here intervened by increasing cash reserves requirement to decrease liquidity within the banking system. So whenever Reserve Bank increase cash reserves, the vault money will be increasing. Remember, money on vault is not available to spend. So the vault money will be increasing, but money supply will be dropping down. As the money supply decreases, then consumers' businesses will be spending less on goods and services. Commercial banks keep most of their revenues in the central bank, which which money available for credit creation in the economy. So whenever the what you call the cash reserves is increasing, more money will be kept on the custody. Commercial banks are forced to reserve a certain portion of their revenues, hold on to without spending in the economy, so that there will be less money supply. That will be discouraging them from creating more credit, and that will lead to less money supply. This decreases aggregate demand and decrease the prices in the economy. So let's check. Cash reserves is increasing. If it increases from 2.5% to 4%, what will happen? So that will mean the vault money will increase, but money supply will decrease. As money supply decreases, what will happen? Aggregate demand for goods will be decreasing because people are not having enough money. As the demand for goods and services decreases, what happens? It slows down to match what we call, it will be matching maybe aggregate supply. For that reason, prices will then be decreasing, and then if they decrease enough, then the inflation will also be decreasing. Then we've combated inflation. So we only do this if inflation is above the target range of 6%. We continue with open market transaction. Here we talk about the Reserve Bank intervening to either sell or buying bonds into the open market. So with the high level of inflation, central bank intervened by selling bonds into the commercial banks. Remember, the transaction in this situation takes place between commercial banks and the central bank, where the Reserve Bank will be selling government bonds into, or shares or paper assets into the open market, which is then they are bought by commercial banks. As commercial banks are buying bonds from the Reserve Bank, the money they were having will be decreasing, meaning they won't be creating enough credit in the economy. So if ever Reserve Bank buy bonds from commercial banks, it sells bonds to commercial banks, it is taking money from the circulation, meaning it remains with more money in the custody and less money supply will be available in the circulation. So quantitative easing is achieved when the central bank buy financial securities or paper assets from commercial banks to increase quantity of money within the circulation. So to curb inflation, or to reduce or combat inflation, or to get rid or eradicate inflation, central bank sells bonds into commercial banks or open market to collect money from the circulation. This reduces money supply in the economy because money in the Reserve Bank is not available for the usage. So the decrease in money supply decreases the aggregate demand on goods and services, which will be decreasing the price level or inflation. So the open market transaction or open market operation. So what happens here? Reserve Bank will be sell bonds, will be selling. As Reserve Bank sell bonds into the open market, commercial banks will be buying those bonds. As they buy those bonds, money supply will be decreasing. As money supply decreases, what will happen? The aggregate demand in the economy will decrease. Why we say the demand will be decreasing? Once commercial banks buy bonds from the Reserve Bank, they remain with less money to create loans or credit. For that reason, there won't be more money supply available in the economy. Then the demand for goods and services will be decreasing. As the demand for goods and services decreases, that will be meaning it will match what we call the aggregate supply. Then the prices will be decreasing, and then inflation rate will also be decreasing. Then we have combated inflation in that situation. Moral persuasion. We know that central bank instruct commercial bank to behave in a manner that is highly desirable based on economic condition. Why? We know that people are always tempted to spend. If there is more credit creation, they spend money they don't even have. So it is therefore important for central bank to instruct commercial banks to do what? To tighten or restrict moral persuasion whenever inflation is above the target rate, so that there will be less spending in the economy. Let's check what happens then in this situation. Availability of credit increase the demand for goods and services. The central bank tighten the moral persuasion or moral suasion to reduce inflation rate, meaning it makes it difficult for financial institution to create loans. It instructs commercial banks to be stricter when creating credit if inflation rate is above the maximum target. Commercial banks are instructed to act in a manner that is highly desirable or suitable for prevailing economic conditions. If inflation is too high or above the target of 3%, then they need to behave in a manner that is restrictive when they fight inflation or when they create credit. Okay. Then let's check. Before inflation targeting, Let's say we talk about moral suasion. What happens? Central bank will tighten moral persuasion, making it difficult. By doing so, the credit creation will be decreasing. That will lead to money supply decreasing. As money supply decreases, what will happen? The demand for goods and services will decrease because there are no temptations to demand if ever there's less money available. As the demand decreases, prices will be decreasing, and then inflation will also be decreasing. That's how we combat inflation, using the moral persuasion or moral suasion. We also call this one credit control. Inflation targeting. Central bank also intervened by setting inflation targeting to ensure that inflation doesn't increase or decrease recklessly. It moves within the target range so that it can be manageable easily to ensure price stability. Central bank sets inflation targets that and applies measures to meet the said targets. It is believed that by setting target, inflation expectation of consumers, producers, employers, and the workers will be reduced, and that they will behave in such a way that way to achieve the said target. Whenever the Reserve Bank set the target, everything that it has to do is to ensure that children are playing within the yard. So they cannot jump the fence, they are playing within. So in that situation, that means they are within the target range. Should they jump the fence, inflation is out of the target. There must be intervention because inflation is above the target range. And then we continue. This raises the cost of credit and reduces the availability of credit to the various sectors in the economy. And then we continue. Combating the cost push inflation. On the previous one, we were combating the demand pull inflation. Now let's check. The examiner can come to you during the prelim and say, discuss in detail measures to combat cost push inflation. Don't be surprised. Increase productivity. Increases in factor productivity are the best options to increase the supply and reduce the prices. Wage increase need to be accompanied by productivity increase in order to keep prices relatively low. Also, still on this one, increasing competition. If ever there's high level of competition, there will be more business producing more goods and services, which will lead to competitive prices and reduce the inflation rate. Human resource development, meaning education and training. So it forms a very important part of the structural measures to improve the supply side in the economy. So if ever people are well trained and skilled, they tend to be more efficient and productive. So they spend less time and less resources to produce more goods and services, which can lead to economies of scale, and that will be reducing inflation. Improve technology. Technology can increase productivity and aggregate supply to release price pressure. If ever the firm has adapted to modern technology, it produces more goods at a shorter period of time, spending less resources. For that reason, that will lead to the firm having what we call an economies of scale. Then there will be no inflation in that situation. The competition. The best method of keeping a check on profit margins is to ensure competition domestically and internationally. So encouraging competition is one of the strategies applied in the fight against inflation, because it is a greatest advantage. If ever local firms can be competitive locally and abroad, that can lead to them charging competitive prices because of the increase in competition. Less government intervention easily attract foreign direct investments into the economy, which increases the productivity. So should there be a deregulation that attract more firms to invest in South African economy, which will be increasing competition and result in high level of productivity and output, as well as competitive prices. Import controls. Tightening import control negatively impact the cost of production. If import controls are too high, that can lead to the increased cost of production for domestic firms. This decreases competitiveness of businesses. It is therefore important for the government to implement import control measures, to relax import control measures, so that there will be less what we call production cost for businesses. They must reduce those import control measures on basically imported capital goods, so that firms will produce at the lower cost with using those machines. For that reason, there will be a lower cost of production. So, evaluation the success of inflation targeting in South Africa. Success factors. It has been able to curb demand pull inflation by limiting consumption. Inflation target gives confidence to investors as they remain confident that prices will remain stable within the economy. Makes consumers to feel secured about future of inflation rate. It reduces economic uncertainties, which create a platform for sound economic growth and investments. Promoting accountability for South African Reserve Bank by ensuring that it adjusts interest rate if inflation goes below or above the target range. Failures. Inflation target was introduced to control demand pull inflation rather than the cost push inflation. Cost push inflation is caused by factors that fall outside the control of the monetary policy. So the Reserve Bank cannot control what we call inflation easily, other than maybe lowering the repo rate for businesses. So this instrument cannot mainly reduce inflation for businesses. Inflation for businesses or cost push inflation is caused by factor inputs that are in there. So they are not affected by the demand for goods and services. So that's a failure because measures undertaken by the Reserve Bank are not really relaxing inflation, if ever it's a cost push inflation, but they make the situation even worse. Reserve Bank mainly reduces or combats the demand pull inflation. That's what it does. But then it can also reduce the cost push only by affecting repo rate or interest rate, which will then be benefiting those that borrowed capital or use borrowed capital to buy capital goods and services. So price of key imports cannot be managed by inflation target, and they increase prices of final goods excessively. So it is therefore important for the state to ensure that there is exchange rate stability. Inflation target result to economic strain when existing inflation is the cost push, but central bank use measures to combat the demand pull inflation. This is the assessment, the final part of the lesson. So the middle order, why is the headline inflation always higher than the core inflation? We know that headline inflation has not been adjusted, while core inflation has been adjusted. It does not have an effect of what? Of goods and services with highly volatile prices. These questions require full explanation, and candidate must be able to link. You don't just list here, you will be getting less marks. South African CPI between 2021 and 2022. South Africa, this is a data response. South African Consumer Price Index increased from the average of 97.5% in the financial year of 2021 to 104.2% in 2022. The 6.7 increase in Consumer Price Index was a result of depreciated currency, fuel cost increase, and lower productivity. Source, Stats SA. These are questions. Identify the type of inflation associated with increase in fuel price. It's a cost push inflation. And then name one way in which inflation is measured. There were three: indexes, weighting, and inflation rate. Continue. Briefly describe the term core inflation. So core inflation excludes items from the CPI basket that have highly volatile prices and items which prices are affected by the government intervention and policy. We continue. Why should the wage rate be determined at the same or higher than rate than inflation rate or consumer price index? Workers must enjoy better or same standard of living. Workers should be able to afford basic goods. They should have enough money to satisfy their needs and wants. Questions: the effect of inflation, which could reduce disposable income and what we call a living standard. The real wage increase to keep track with the cost of living. We continue. Calculate inflation rate for 2022. Show all calculations. Remember, CPI for the current year minus CPI for previous year divided by CPI previous year multiplied by 100. 104.2 minus 97.5 divided by 97.5 multiplied by 100. That gives us inflation rate of 6.87% or 7%. Then you go to the higher order. Analyze the behavior of different role players in the economy during high inflation expectation. Meaning, if ever government, households, businesses expect high inflation, what can they do? High inflation expectation affect decision making by all economic role players or stakeholders as they try to protect the buying power parity of their money. And then consumers or households immediately increase their spending while their income can still afford more goods and services. They can also postpone their spending by saving their income for future purchases. Producers or businesses produce more goods and services now while their input costs are still cheap. They also increase selling prices to keep up with high profit as they compensate themselves for future losses during high inflation. This can fuel the inflation. We'll continue. Trade unions start negotiating for wage and salaries increment for their members to enjoy better living standard when inflation is high. This may lead to industrial instabilities if wage negotiations do not bring mutual benefit. There can be social unrest in there because of mass actions. Government through Reserve Bank intervened by increasing repurchase rate to reduce money supply to curb the spending. The summary of the lesson: inflation has a huge impact on economic activities and social welfare. We know that should inflation increase, there will be decrease in economic activity because people afford less goods and services. Investors tend to be less optimistic or pessimistic about investing in the country. Social wellness is compromised because as people not affording their basic needs, that means welfare has been compromised, the welfare loss. Changes in the inflation affect the purchasing power parity of money. So as inflation change, or let's say inflation is increasing, the money will afford less goods and services. But if inflation decreases, the money will afford more goods and services. South African Reserve Bank uses monetary policy to cool down inflation if it's above 6%, while the government uses fiscal policy. It is important for the state and the South African Reserve Bank to intervene to manage inflation because it erodes the value of money and creates a bad environment for investors. The South African inflation target is between 3 to 6%. Minimum target is 3%. Maximum target is 6%. And then our next lesson will be on the 10th of September 2025. Our just-in-time lesson 14:30 to 16 hours, paper 1 revision, where I will be discussing basically preparation for our preparatory examination, which will be our paper 1. I will meet you there. So please keep the date or save the date so that I can gear you to the preparatory examination as we go on. Thank you. Let's meet on the date that has been indicated on the presentation.